I've explicitly titled my talk Text Mining and Not Large Language Models, although I'm aware that the session is called Large Language Models. There will be some things about large language models, but I'm also here to convince you that for some of the things you can also use natural language processing that is sort of the foundation of large language models without the large language models and still be productive in a sense. I quickly want to acknowledge my group members, Lei Zhang and Doa Mohammed and Sevide Bagayiravari, who contributed to the results I'm presenting. In the beginning, I kind of want to set the stage a little bit and give a little bit more of an overview how I tend to think about materials data. And I think I'm here at the right audience. I'm usually more in the NFDI MAT work just by historical reasons, but I think there is sufficient overlap that this is kind of the same thing from different communities. And I think what we have at our disposal is sort of a little bit problematic, but also with a lot of opportunities, and that's why these initiatives do exist. And I think that we have a lot of materials data today, and the challenge is, although we do have it, the challenge is still that we have to implement a data culture. So this is in a way providing workflows that automatically record all the metadata and so on and so forth. You need to establish workflows for integration of the data from different sources. This also has to do with user trainings and the big question of how do you represent certain aspects of materials data in a proper way. And this means that the tools that I'm trying to work on, or I'm actually working on, not trying to, and I guess many of you are, tools that allow an efficient navigation of this space. So what I've brought you here is a sketch of how I tend to think about materials data. And you could think of the two dimensions down here, materials dimension 1 and dimension 2, as somehow encoding chemistry with a dimensionality reduction method. And what you see as the height here, also encoded in color, could be the number of data points for a given composition. So for example, this peak here, originally come from engineering, could be all the data we have about steels. It's a very narrow composition range. The majority of the atoms in there are steels, and then you have some trace elements in there. And just by the technological relevance, we in general have a lot of data about steels, which makes this peak high. And there are other material classes from the engineering side, nickel, aluminum-based superalloys and aluminum-based alloys, which are a little bit broader in composition, and you still have data, but maybe not as much. And there's still a lot underexplored, and that sort of sets the stage for the tools I will provide later. Because the unexplored parts of, say, a composition, also composition processing correlations, is where we need acceleration and where data is typically sparse. The data sources generally at our disposal are, of course, very broadly speaking, from experiments and simulations. I've just listed a number of databases with a number I could find. I'm actually not sure how all of these resources count their data. Sometimes it's clear, sometimes it's not so clear. I just want to highlight here this compounded data set, which also includes this Alexandria database that is hosted at ICAMS. Well, it's also already included there, so you don't need double accounting. Since we're here talking about large language models, and to me, to my impression, underused source are publications. And it's very hard to find appropriate numbers, as I have found. How many material science publications do we actually have? So depending on which kind of index you look for, you have some millions. The question is it usable in the sense of FAIR? Can you find it, access it? Is it interoperable with other data modalities? And then, of course, reuse it. There's a nice work from around Kevin Jablonka, who is kind of famous in Germany for pushing forward what you can do with LLMs and material science. And one of their papers has this statistic in there where they, which is based on yet another statistic, and they extended it here, where they tried the WOS stands for Web of Science, so that's the Clarivet Web of Science Index. They tried to count the number of material science papers according to certain categories that were chosen based on a different paper, just to be in continuation. So what we have currently, I'm not sure if this is saturating or just a dip, but we have around 200,000 papers per year that are loosely associated with material science. And that is definitely too much to process as a human. The same publication, and I think is it you? Yeah, okay. So the author sits here. The number of sort of semi-structured data sets, so the data site is a metadata format, which is very basic, but it is a common format, or at least a suggested format to encode materials data, is orders of magnitude lower. I mean, you see a surge a little bit, but it's not really an upwards trend. Or if you look at Zenodo, maybe we can talk later how you calculate this, but the actual numbers don't matter, it's orders of magnitude lower. And the big question here is, even if you had 200,000 per year Zenodo data sets, I'm not sure if you ever had tried to get multiple Zenodo data sets and use them collectively. So they're not connected like in a framework like Nomad or other larger databases. So it's very heterogeneous, like the scientific literature. So what do we need for machine learning, for acceleration, for a lot of data? We need structured data sets. And as I now said, only a fraction of the experimental, particularly the experimental data, is published in raw form. So you have access to raw data that is sort of computationally accessible. It's published in papers, and most means orders of magnitudes. And the two approaches that I'm going to present today, on which we are working in that realm, are two. One is a very high-level approach, where you use high-dimensional vector representations of composition, of processes, of sample preparations. And the second one is the actual extraction of structured data sets from unstructured publications. And this is using LLMs. I'm a fan of motivating the things you do for practical reasons, so that's why I'm setting the stage here with the materials discovery. And I've brought this here because I think most people think about materials discovery like this sketch from that paper. You've tried to find the needle in the haystack, the one thing that is different from the others and that might provide you with some kind of functionality. And what they then show is, okay, the traditional approaches, well, you sift through all of the compositions and try to find the properties of it. And today with machine learning, we can do some kind of automation. The thing I don't like about this picture is that you don't know what this filter is. So what you're looking for, new combined functionality or new chemistry, but how do we encode this in a filter like the magnet here for the needle? So what you actually want is you want all of that space that I presented in the beginning to come up. So you want the data points from all of the compositions or composition property combinations, not a specific filter. I mean, it's good if you can define your problem, but in general, for materials discovery, I think it's more useful to explore the space and navigate the space. The context in which we are working from the experimental side, so I'm not the part who's doing the experiments, but I get data from the experimentalists, are these wafers here. So you can imagine this as a 10 centimeter wafer. I mean, it is a 10 centimeter wafer, and what they do in the group of Alfred Ludwig here at RUB is they deposit a thin film of different elements on there. And that's what they then call a composition spread materials library. It's coming from high throughput experimentation. So each point here gives you a different composition, and it's a smooth gradient in different elements. You will see in the next slide how this looks. And they have the capabilities to measure a lot of properties. The actual composition, not only the desired one, the crystal structure that comes out after annealing, the resistance, the band gap, and so on and so forth. And then from there on, you can work your way up for which kind of application might this be useful. The problem is you can fit 342 measurement points on there, typically with a composition sequence of 1% steps in all directions. And that's by far too low a number to cover this space. And also it's a thin film. It's very useful, but it's a thin film. But in this context, there is a need to speed up this characterization. And that's the first example that I'm going to show. So you see here an example of the composition gradients here from the yellow to the blue. It's iridium, palladium, platinum, rhenium, and ruthenium. You see they go in all different directions, so each point has a different composition. And one target property is the measured resistance. And you can see that this resistance roughly goes from low to high, from maybe in terms of a watch, 130 to 730 roughly. So that's the gradient. And it's a smooth gradient with respect to the composition. Now measuring this takes 340 times the time it takes this measurement to take in this setup, which admittedly in this specific case is only a couple of minutes. But you can imagine other measurements, like in our context, we're looking for new electrocatalytic active materials. Then the measurement itself changes the surface. Also, it's much longer. And so you want to cover the space rather quickly and still have a good idea where are the points that are interesting. And that is where we used, in one study, priors from a DFT. So we calculated something that is correlated with the resistance via a Kubo-Greenwood. I'm not the expert in this, so this was done by the collaborators. And we also used word embeddings to calculate the similarity of each composition with the resistance. I've said that the actual ground truth gradient goes from 130 to 730 roughly. So both of them are not really good. They're not the real thing. But how we used this data that is loosely correlated is we ran 40 random initializations of active learning loops and then got an initialization which got a fast convergence, and that was then applied to the actual measurement. So what you see here is the mean absolute error as a function of the iterations, which means the number of measurement points. The greenish line here in the middle is sort of a baseline, which means you take 40 random initializations of the actual sample, and then you see how fast it converges, and then you average all of those. You see the faint green lines in the back, which are the individual tests. If we try to approximate this gradient based on this DFT correlation, we essentially have no convergence. So the model doesn't learn fast. It's a Gaussian process, by the way. But if we use other strategies for initialization from DFT or word embedding, you can see a very fast convergence to the actual measurement uncertainty. So after roughly 60, 70, maybe 80, depending on what your limit is for acceptance, instead of 342, you have a good idea how this sample's composition property relationship is. And then you can blow this up. So within this collaborative research center, we have multiple samples. So each of these numbers refers to a specific sample, and each of these tags refers to a different kind of initializations. I just want to draw you to some of them. The T5S, which you, for example, can find here or here, or here or here, is a correlation based on word embedding. So what we did here is we not only used one modality of prior knowledge to initialize this process, but we used two modalities. And it's not 100% clear, but these from this figure, but on this you just have to trust me because of time limitations, that these word embedding correlations are very helpful in speeding up the measurement. And the way this is sped up, this heat map shows the measurement reduction. So from 342 minus what you see here as a number, and the dark spots give you the highest reduction. So on average, we get about we only need about 80%. And this is insofar interesting as that each and every sample gets its own specific initialization. What they did before is they usually have a cross pattern and they start at every point, which might not be the best starting point to approximate this composition property relationship. And once you have this is super easy to calculate, also beforehand, before you even go into the lab. The question is, why does it work so well? And I don't have an answer. And the original authors, so the original author of this word-to-vec embedding was Mikolov, but there's a very nice paper explaining it only a year later. And they have a separate chapter on this. And to my knowledge, even today, people don't know why it works. It's just empirically known that these embeddings kind of produce useful representations of words that encode somehow correlations. You can see it here. Why does this produce good word representations? We don't know. I also cannot tell you. I can just tell you it works quite well. So a little bit more on the theory side. The word embeddings are based on abstracts in our case. We tokenize it, and then a small neural network is trained that gives you numbers. Here I explicitly trained one that has only 2 dimensions as an output. The actual dimensions are 200 that we use in our models, which means each word gets a numerical representation of 200 numbers. But you can then, and this is the nice thing here, if you only use 2, you can already encode relationships. So I've brought you here nickel, platinum with the coordinates and properties like dielectric and conductivity. And here you can see in this space, platinum is closer to dielectric, where it's further away from conductivity, and nickel is maybe slightly closer to conductivity. And the one thing that I want to add here is, which is the assumption, since most materials don't exist in the literature, meaning 75% iron, 1% cobalt, 3.5% something, you need a way to encode arbitrary compositions. And our assumption is that we can approximate the embedding of any arbitrary composition by using the baseline representation. So this V is the 200-dimensional vector for nickel, and this is one for platinum. And if we have a mixture of 50-50, then we just approximate in between, which means in this plot here, it falls right in between. And this kind of works also from the training. So if you look at this is now the 200-dimensional representation. Some of these clusters of elements group. You can also see that this specific one here goes from carbon, tungsten carbide to tungsten, and tungsten carbide is close to nickel, given the corpus that we trained it on. But you can also see that this really comes out automatically, even if you don't impose it. But we need a way to encode these arbitrary compositions. And the same thing goes for all sorts of properties. So what you see here is a color-coded map with the closest words around a specific term here. And you can form this map. I don't find these maps super useful, but they kind of give you an idea how these data points are related without actually being useful, at least for me. But point is, you get some kind of correlations of words that are just a word, but we interpret them as an element, and other words that we interpret as a property, and then you can calculate a similarity or a proximity and so on and so forth. One way how we used that in the past is we try to extrapolate. So imagine you have the same kind of wafer, but now only a ternary, gold, palladium, ruthenium, with these composition gradients, and you have a specific electrochemical performance. This is a current at voltage at 850 millivolts. Then you have another materials library which has gold, palladium, and platinum. So they share 2 elements, but the third one is different, and they're also different here, and they have a different electrochemical performance. And now the question was, can we train a model based on the 2 ternaries and extrapolate into the quaternary, which would mean we learn from correlations and then we put that into a higher dimensional space, and maybe can say if it's worth exploring that. And this higher dimensional composition space is then the shared one, silver, palladium, platinum, ruthenium with the different gradients. And you can see here the performance. So this is the measurement with these outliers that you can see here. So there was actually nothing measured. This is a Gaussian process that uses fractional compositions as input. This is a combination of word vectors and fractional composition, and this is what we developed, what we call a similarity measure. It's not directly the current at the current density, but you can see that this gradient in this case, which goes from, so more negative is better, from this 730 to 130, and this almost exactly approximates this gradient. And even though we don't have the actual current at voltage, we can still say this composition region here is likely the one that is best performing, so you don't have to do the experiments on the other side. Now you might question, okay, who has ternaries and quaternaries, and you want to go maybe even higher? And the answer is almost nobody. So the next question is, what do you do if you don't even have experimental data to do such kind of a fit? And we've developed a method that I'm going to outline a little bit, where we start with the literature collection, with this library that we're using with pre-processing, and then the first step is to train a doc2vec model, which is the same concept as a word embedding, but for a whole document. So you get a numerical representation of a choosable size, and then you can numerically compare how close two abstracts are. Then we use PCA and a greedy document selection in batches of 50, and have a corpus that incorporates increasingly more diverse sources. So this greedy selection means you start in the center, so what do all the abstracts have in common in this representation, and then you choose the one that is furthest apart and then furthest apart from the other one, and so on and so forth, until you sample this space in batches of 50, and it gets denser and denser. And then we compute the similarities as before. We check the centroid stability, so how much does the embedding change if I add 50 more papers? And if we deem it stable, which is just a heuristic threshold, then we say we go to the analysis and predict something. The idea came up because we thought that maybe we can get away with less documents that have less noise, and the models are smaller, but they still contain the correlations that we want. So how does that work? So what you see here is a representation in a principal component space of this doc2vec embeddings. So the 200-dimensional doc2vec embeddings projected into 2 with PCA. And you can see the numbers, and so this gets denser, so it's selected from all of them. So you have 50, so 6 times 50, so 300, 350, 400 papers. And this is this space in which we check the centroid stability. So you have the first one, then you have a large change of the centroid, you have yet another large change, and so if I could overload this image now, but you get the idea. The embedding space changes, and if the change from one centroid to the next is below a certain threshold, we deem it converged. So that's what you see here. This is the centroid distance as a function of the iteration. So the iteration means adding batches of 50 papers. And this jumps around quite a bit, but they all go below a threshold of I think it was 0.25. And then we just stop. You could argue that maybe another one would be even lower. But this was so far useful enough. And we do this specific for a material system. So each sample or each material system that you're exploring gets its own corpus. So it's a problem-specific corpus selection that is also converged, how we call it. And then we go into the space that is now converged, and I cannot explain you why it works yet, but it works. We calculate each composition's similarity to dielectric and to conductivity, and this is based on actually an abstract for an Eminöter group by Peter Kraus, because he said he wanted to develop methods, experimental methods that measure the conductivity of a given material and the dielectric constant, and thereby be predictive for catalytic applications. So it was just a hunch. And then we do a Pareto front optimization. So in this space for the oxygen evolution reaction, we look for the compositions that are on the upper edge, and for the hydrogen evolution reaction and the oxygen reduction reaction, we look for the compositions on the lower edge. And this is just one of 6 examples where a huge space in nickel, palladium, platinum, and ruthenium was experimentally checked, and here higher is better, so it's OER, higher current. And you can see all the blue values here. And this is the selection that is based on our prediction, what would be the good or worthy points to explore. So from around 4,000 compositions, we can narrow it down to 342. In other words, without using any experimental input, just using this strategy with the doc2vec selection and so on and so forth, centroid convergence, and then the Pareto front, we can pinpoint the region in this space, which is likely interesting, reaction specific for OER. And it also worked for ternary, quaternary, quinary, other 6, in total 6 material systems. We're currently trying to find the limit where it doesn't work. Then, the next part is I promise you to give you some input about LLMs. We kind of projected all of that heterogeneous data into one continuous vector space, this word embedding space. But there is more. It's actually one of your own who wrote, how do you manage data? That essentially two ends of the spectrum. Either you accept that there is heterogeneity, meaning it comes from different communities with different standards, with all of that, or you develop those standards and enforce them. So either when you use it, you create something that is homogeneous, or at creation at the source. The word embedding part is here, you just ignore what it is and you homogenize it. The other part is actually extracting structured data sets. So this is not automatically colored. This is what I did by hand on this. I call this post-publication research data management, because this is an abstract from this paper where they describe how they fabricated a chrome cobalt nickel alloy in a given machine with given parameters and so on and so forth. And of course, changes in these parameters will affect how the properties of the materials are, heat treatments and so on and so forth. And we're developing methods for large language models that we just loosely call a query engine with prompting, where we can ask what are the different processing and processing parameters and processing stages in this, and then we get a response. So I've reformatted this, but this is the actual output of such a query. So it's the LLM then says, okay, there's a process called vacuum induction melting with some properties, then there's homogenization with some properties, and then swaging, and then you can put on your glasses for material science and say, okay, but these are not the different processes and so on and so forth. But you start getting something. The current process and explicitly work in process is PDF to Markdown, then a rag to find the experimental section, a prompt to get a JSON object that is already structured, but not structured and comparable to other structured ones, and then we have yet another round of homogenizing, and this is where ontologies come into play. Where we want to go is we want this not only for text but for tables and figures, and there are approaches where we try to embed figures in a way and predict what's seen in the figure. I know that other people are working on this too, or even combining it with the caption of the figure and then pinpointing the text in the paper where this figure is mentioned, or where related information information to the figure is presented just by text proximity. But at least my experience is it's super messy, and so that's why it's still a work in progress. And with this, I come to my conclusions. For the word embeddings, it's very quick, it works, but we don't know why. We have yet to find the limit. The question that we always get is if other non-fixed context embeddings would be better, like the bidirectional encodings, BERT, MUTBERT, SciBERT, you probably have heard of those. I cannot tell you, we have not tried them yet. So far, these baseline word embeddings work quite well. The only other thing I want to conclude about the unstructured to structured is, I'm not sure how many of you are experimentalists, but maybe some thought for experimental procedures. Maybe at some point we get to a schema where people publish their experimental details as a structured data set on Zenodo and just say the sample was prepared and then a citation, and then you can connect also different and same preparation techniques. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.